Hi, Spin Sisters. My name is Meghan McDonough, and I want to welcome you to Mental Training Mondays. And today we're going to be talking about motivation to ride during the pandemic, and really motivation anytime, because a lot of these tips are good any time of the year. Just to let you know a little bit about me, some of you know me, but some of you don't. If you're new to Spin Sisters, welcome. I'm an exercise and sports psychologist who works at U of C, and I'm a Spin Sister. And so Fiona asked me if I would contribute some submissions to Mental Training Mondays. And so today we're going to talk about motivation, and there'll be a couple more coming up in the future too. So to get started, I just want to say motivation fluctuates for everybody from time to time. And so I hope that in what we talk about today, you'll find some tips that might be helpful for you. Maybe right now things are going great. Maybe right now you're having some struggles, but they might help increase improve your toolkit for what to do when motivation kind of wanes sometimes. Also, motivation can be harder when conditions aren't ideal. That happens a lot this time of year anyways, because we're dealing with things like wet trail conditions. As I record this morning, it was we had a little bit of snow again, even though it's May, so not ideal. And also, of course, some things are harder right now to do, and it's harder to rely on our usual motivations during the pandemic. So it's an especially good time to think about this topic. So I'm going to think about some examples that work for a number of different scenarios, because also things are changing and fluctuating a lot for a lot of us right now. So I am going to think about the fact that sometimes we can mountain bike. We just opened up the trails again, or the parking lots at some of the trails recently, but there's restrictions still, of course, on riding together, so it's not just times like usual. Also, of course, sometimes we can ride, but perhaps it might be road riding instead, or on gravel, because the trail conditions also aren't good, or we can't, or sometimes when those trails are closed, or we might have to only do routes we can do from home. Also, sometimes we might be riding indoors on a trainer or stationary bike because of the restrictions, or also because of the weather or whatever it is in your schedule that might keep you inside. But a lot of this advice will also work for training and other activities that you might do as well. So things you might be doing for your general fitness that aren't even on a bike. So feel free to apply and use it wherever you can. We have a lot of different reasons that motivate us, and that's the approach I want to talk about today. I'm not going to just talk about being motivated or not, but how the why we're motivated and why that matters. So I want to talk to you a little bit about what some of those kinds of reasons might be, and I just want to share this with you here. So one way of thinking about motivation is that we have these different kinds of motivation, and they go in some different categories, and I've got them outlined here. So if you start at the top there, we have the reasons that are around things like I love it, or it's meaningful to me, and you might really like the process of it or the feeling of it. We call that intrinsic motivation, so doing it for the sake of doing it. We also have kinds of motivation where we're motivated because doing the activity is part of who you are, part of your identity. Sometimes we're doing an activity because we like what we get out of it. We have some goals that are important to us and valued outcomes, and we want to achieve those. Sometimes we're doing an activity because we feel like we should do it, or maybe we'd feel guilty if we didn't. Sometimes we are doing an activity because we're going to get some kind of reward from it. Maybe somebody else is rewarding us, or maybe we're rewarding ourselves, or maybe we're rewarding some negative outcomes. Or maybe we're avoiding some negative outcomes. And then also, sometimes we're not feeling very motivated. And sometimes that's because, maybe we aren't getting the effects that we want or the outcomes we want. And we're starting to feel like, I don't know why I bother. And I'm going to kind of organize how we talk about motivation by these different reasons today and address each of them. And you're going to quickly recognize a couple of things. First of all, they're organized on a continuum from sort of more to less effective, or more to less sort of good reasons. So we are going to talk about how it's great and you want to be closer to that I love it end, and farther away from that I don't know why I bother end. And we'll talk a little bit about some ways to do that. Also, I really want to acknowledge that we all feel these various different kinds of reasons from time to time. So it's not like it's bad if you're having those I don't know why I bother thoughts, or if you're relying on rewards occasionally, but they're not going to be as effective for you. You can kind of get into trouble on those ends. So we're going to be talking about trying to move towards that more positive end. But also sometimes we have multiple reasons, right? There might be more than one thing going on at once. So I'm not trying to say that it's you should be worried if you've thought the thoughts on the not as good end of the continuum, but we're going to talk about how to rely more and more on those more effective kinds of motivation. Okay, so I'm going to start on that I love it end, and I'm just going to come back here. So when we're thinking about intrinsic motivation, doing things because we love it, because it's meaningful, it's when we're riding because it's fun. We don't like to do things in our life in general that aren't fun or aren't rewarding or aren't meaningful to us as much as the things that are, right? Or it might be something that's not necessarily what you call fun in the moment, but it might be meaningful or powerful to you. Like you might feel really good about learning or accomplishing something new, even if the journey to get there is kind of hard, okay? Or it maybe isn't fun all the time while you're in it. Or sometimes meaning comes from something in the experience that might not be like the riding itself. So for example, you might really like riding with your partner or with your child because of the experience you have together, even if that ride isn't optimally challenging your skills, for example. So there's lots of different ways you might find that meaning or find that fun, okay? But so how do we get into the zone of being intrinsically motivated? Okay. First of all, try and choose things that are fun for you, right? And I know that's why you signed up for Spin Sisters. We can ride together on awesome trails with all these fantastic like-minded women, and we can't quite do that right now. So obviously we all have gone in that direction and kind of understand that already. But what are some of the things we can do even though we can't have what we really wanted right in this moment? Okay. One thing to think about is, this is probably the most obvious one, if you can get out on your mountain bike, whether it's now or in the coming weeks or over the summer, and of course, only when the trails are in good shape, only when the public health officials say it's okay, and it's really important, of course, too, to make sure we're riding sort of well within our skill levels so we're not risking, injury and stuff like that. It's a bad time for that. But assuming you can ride, right? Try and get out on your mountain bike because that's what you love, right? Even if it's more limited than before, right? So for example, maybe some of the conditions that mean that you can only get out on the weekend, or you can only get out once a week. Try not to get to focus on the only part, but to still prioritize doing that part that you think is fun, the getting out to ride when you can. Also, maybe the trails you can go on are more limited. I know, especially a couple of weeks ago before they started talking about the fact that we might be able to go to some of the other trails in the coming weeks, I was really thinking about like, okay, well, what are the trails that I can ride to from my house in the city here? I'm living in Calgary. That, maybe I sometimes pass by because I could go to Bragg Creek or I could go to the park, and I don't ride as often, but maybe right now they'd give me that sort of mountain bike experience that I maybe can't get to, especially when some of those trails were closed. And I mentioned that I know that part might be past, but we have to recognize it might come back. So it might be something to kind of keep in your back pocket. Or maybe you even can go somewhere where you can drive to it, but maybe it's not maybe the trail in your top 10 list just isn't in the cards this summer or something like that. So trying to find those times to ride in the places you can. Now, if you can't get out on your mountain bike, can you bike, right? There might be something that you like about riding a bike, and the mountain bike is the thing. And maybe there's something you like about the feel of actually cycling, or maybe you love descending and you can't do the great descent on the mountain bike trail, but maybe you can find some, rolling climbs on a mountain bike where you can still have that feeling of descending and the feeling of flow on your bike. Maybe it's a feeling of climbing, right? And you can maybe focus on those things even when you're on your road bike or on a gravel bike or something like that if you can't get to the trail. Or it might be that you can focus on how it makes you feel, right? Maybe it's that feeling of actually getting to unwind after work. I know I love that one myself. Or maybe it's helping you, feel interested instead of bored if you were feeling bored in your day, dealing with work anxiety or that kind of thing, right? So maybe it's those feelings that are really feeling good. So it gets harder, of course, when the experience of what you get to do is farther and farther away from the thing that you love. So if you're riding indoors, right? If you're riding on a stationary bike or you're riding on a trainer right now, it's like cycling, right? But it's even more different than road biking is. And it might be a little bit more limited, and you might have to get a little more creative or thoughtful about how to make it fun, right? So you could consider both options that help you associate with the activity itself. So think about what's fun about the activity. And you can also think about options to make the activity fun that kind of distract you from the activity. And we call that dissociative strategies. So the terms probably don't matter too much for you, but those ones that help you engage with what might be fun about riding on the trainer or on the stationary bike. Some of the things like online workouts are really good for this, for some people at least. If you like the workout part and keeps you engaged and sort of thinking about the riding, and maybe having a structured program to push yourself. I know there's some like online programs with structured workouts as well that try and engage you a little bit more. Like I haven't used Zwift, for example, myself, but I know, some friends who really talk about it, making it fun, right? So if there's something like that that you really enjoy and you could use, they might help make the biking on the trainer or the stationary bike more fun. Some of the more dissociative strategies are things that help you maybe think less about the fact that you're biking and make the experience more fun or engaging for you by distracting you, okay? So watch a movie while you ride, listen to an audiobook or a podcast, talking to a friend on the phone while you ride. Music also can go in here, but you can, because music doesn't always, depending on how you're attending to it, doesn't always take up all of your attention. It could be something that's dissociative to you if you're really, really engaged in it and it's helping distract you. It can also be something you have in the background while you're doing an interval workout and doing something more associative. So it can kind of fit in both places. But those kind of things that help distract you. So consider that those two different types of strategies have different effects. If you're really trying to work on something or improve your riding or say like push yourself to improve your fitness, it's going to be more effective if you're actually like thinking about the riding, right? Like you're engaged in the workout and thinking about going hard. If you're more concerned with putting in the time, right? Like staying on your bike for a whole hour or something, right? And if you find that you just get bored and like that's just putting in the time is the real struggle for you. A lot of times the more distracting kind of strategies can help you achieve being, engaging for longer. So, and of course you can use a combination. My favorite is to go for half an hour doing some intervals and then switch over to watching some kind of program and just, ride out the rest of the hour. So that is what I've been doing for the last few weeks. Some other tips that can make exercising of whatever kind more fun, whether it's on your bike or something else that you're doing. One is to try and make the environment a nice place, okay? So doing things that, choosing an environment first if you can that is more fun, right? Like that's why we choose the favorite trail or the place that has a view or all that kind of stuff, right? Again, more limited right now with some of our options, but things like if you're riding the trainer, for example, try and put it in a nice spot. Sometimes we don't want to put it in the best spot in our house, but is there a place that you can put it that's going to feel a little bit more pleasant than maybe some of the other options you have? And then once you've chosen whatever spot it is, are there things you can do to spruce it up that make it sort of more pleasant to be in? Like, do you have good light? Do you have music? Do you have a fan? Do you have decor, like something you can watch and things like that just make it a more pleasant place to be? Also, overall, in general, the research tells us that people tend to get a lot out of getting outside. And I know I'm talking to people who really, really understand that. But if there are ways that you can get outside versus be inside if the weather allows, that can also really enhance that sort of enjoyability factor. So I don't know if I've thought about sticking my trainer out onto the back patio if I can do that, if I can't still ride outside. So some ideas about making things more fun. All right, so let's move on to it's part of who I am kinds of motivation. So is getting out for that ride part of what makes you feel like an athlete? Okay, or part of what makes you feel like a spin sister or a fit and powerful woman, or makes you just feel more human after a day of being on Zoom meetings or wrangling kids or whatever it is you had to do. So thinking about that like embodied contribution to your identity can be a really powerful motivator. So that's what we mean by like that riding or exercising of any kind might sort of be motivating for you because you feel like it's part of who you are, okay? If you sort of focusing on some of those thoughts can also be a really powerful motivator if you're trying to overcome some of those feelings like you shouldn't be spending time on riding. So I know one of the things that a lot of people, especially women, get subjected to is this idea that we should be taking care of all of the other responsibilities around us or all the other people around us before spending any time on ourselves. And whether or not you typically feel that way, if that feeling's kind of creeping in, sometimes if you focus on on thinking about your identity as a rider or as an athlete or as just a human being who deserves and needs movement, can help you overcome some of those feelings and prioritize that ride. It doesn't make scheduling it any easier around all the other things that we have to do, but it can help us feel like we kind of have that right to be able to go out and do things that take care of ourselves, that take care of us. And of course, taking care of ourselves is what helps us to be in a better position for those other responsibilities and taking care of others too. So really with this category, the big thing is sort of just recognizing that might be part of your motivation. It might be part of who you are. You might just be a rider, and that's a great thing to be fueling. And it's something that really can sustain us. I know I talked about like these types of motivation are sort of on this continuum, and the more you are in the I love it category, the more effective those kinds of motivation are. And the I love it category is so effective because doing the activity feeds itself, it fuels itself. If you love to ride and you want to go out and ride, you're likely to go out and do it because it's its own reward, right? And this part of who I am, this identity piece, is only one short step away from that. It's also really, really effective that if you feel like it's part of who you are and something that's important to you, that's also going to kind of fuel itself. Okay. If we go on to the next category, I love what I get out of it. Sometimes we might not love the process of the activity itself, but we like the outcomes, okay? And when I'm talking about this category here, it's gonna be different from the one that's more towards the end where we're getting rewarded or maybe getting prizes or something like that. This is outcomes that are things that like you own and you have bought into and are really, really important to you. So they're valued outcomes that come from within you, okay? So if it's something like, I like being fit, right? Or I really like the emotional effects that it has on me, that it makes me, sort of feel, better at the end of a hard day of work or something like that. Those are also really good and effective motivators. But we've moved a little bit away from the I love it. So one of the things we have to kind of be careful about or just be aware of with these kind of motivators is that they're good or effective if they're what we truly want for ourselves. They're not just what we think we should want or what we've maybe learned to want like throughout our life. So it's great to want to be fit, right? And to want to feel fit. But if you feel that way just because, you feel like that's what society thinks we should feel, that's not going to fit in this category. That's going to be one of the ones I'm talking about later. But if it's that feeling of I want to be fit because I love that feeling and that's really important to me, that's going to be that sustained motivation for you. So some of the things that help you like kind of be in this category is to identify what your goals are. And one of the next mental training Monday sessions that I'm going to do coming up in about 3 or 4 weeks or so is we're going to talk about goals and identifying goals and thinking about all sorts of different kinds of goals and how they can help us. But if you think about what your goals are, even just right now, sort of quick version of this is critically think about whether they're really your own. Okay. And keep up with or keep in mind what those are. What are the things that you really want to get out of riding? And sort of thinking about those and sort of thinking about your motivation to ride for those reasons could be more powerful than the ones that are maybe like goals you've adopted, but that you really kind of don't own yourself. Okay. It also can be helpful because these kinds of motivation aren't I love doing it just for its own sake. Sometimes getting over the hump of getting started can be tough, right? It's like I might really, really like getting fitter from riding, but I might have a hard time getting out the door because I'm not like loving it and feeling that like extra energy to get started. So sometimes what we need is that little extra boost to get us out the door and get started in the first place. So some things that can help with that are having some cues. We call them point of decision cues or prompts. So if it's something like, when you come in, I was going to make an example that was like not really that relevant for a lot of us in the pandemic, but if you were coming home from work, right, and you want to go riding, but you tend to get kind of distracted and pulled in other directions, right? Having something right by the door that reminds you that's like you're going to go ride, like whether it's you've left your shoes out, if you've left your helmet out in a really visible place, that you're going to see it and it's going to remind you, like, just, you know, get out, get started. That can be really, really effective. Right now, I know one of the things that I'm finding, because I'm doing work from home and I'm on my computer a lot, is having something that like interrupts me at the end of the workday, that it's like, it's time for me now, right? So whether it's an alarm or something like that on the computer that says like, hey, like now it's time to go ride or go do whatever it is that I'm going to do that day. So those things that sort of help get us out of maybe the habit that might pull us towards the couch, or maybe it's put towards more work or towards other kinds of things that we might do instead of what it is we've really decided we want to do. So some of those things and other kinds of reminders can be really helpful there too. All right, let's go on to the I should do it, or I'd feel guilty if I didn't do it. So the kinds of motivation we've talked about so far are actually work pretty well, and they can be sustainable kinds of motivation long term. But starting with these, I'm doing it because otherwise I'm going to feel guilty, or I feel like I should, and carrying on with the others, tread really carefully from here on out. Okay, these are kinds of motivation that can get us out there, right? So they are forms of motivation. They do motivate us, but they tend to backfire in the long run. So they might get us out there, but we feel kind of like we're doing it for other people, or we feel kind of controlled, or we don't feel good about it. We're just like avoiding negative feelings like guilt, but we're not really feeling great. And so they can kind of create a love-hate relationship with the activity for us. So they're going to happen sometimes. We're all going to experience them, but try not to lean on these ones or create these ones for yourself to enhance your motivation, because they're not really going to be all that effective long term. Okay? So I also want to make a point that there's a really important difference here when I'm talking about I'm doing something because I feel guilty if I didn't. There's a really important difference between guilt and shame. And some of you may have heard this, you know, in other places before, but just really quickly, feeling guilty is because I feel negatively or badly about something I did or didn't do. Okay, it's like, it's about my actions. Feeling ashamed is like, I feel bad about who I am. Okay. And so in this category, I'm really talking about guilt. It's like, oh, if I feel like if I didn't do the workout, for example, I wouldn't be kind of living up to like my goals or something that's important to me. Okay. That could motivate me in the short term, right? Because it's like, oh no, it's something it's really important to me. I want to kind of repair that. And I'm going to, even though it felt bad to feel guilty, I might still go out and do the activity. Feeling ashamed really makes us avoid, right? If I feel like, oh, I didn't ride, and that's because I'm a bad person or something like that, right? And you know, sometimes we think that way, right? Even though we might not want to talk about it, but it happens, right? But if you feel that, that's really going to lead to avoidance, right? We really, really kind of try to avoid things that make us feel bad about who we are. So that's a whole different category, and we want to avoid that all the time. Okay. The feeling guilty can sometimes, you know, like work for us in the short term again. Like it's like, ooh, I feel guilty about this. I'm going to go out and ride today, or tomorrow I'll make up for it or something. And in the short term, that, you know, again, that motivates us, but we don't want to lean on that. Okay. Partly because it still comes from this place of negativity, and it's sort of that love-hate relationship. Okay. So one way to work on reducing unwanted negative thoughts, particularly those ones if you're like, oh, I feel bad about who I am, because we want to get rid of that all the time. But even if it's like you're starting to rely on those sort of guilt feelings, is you could work on a technique we call thought stopping. So it's just trying to change how we're thinking about what our motivation is. So before you do this at all, there's a couple kind of preparation steps, okay? One is you are going to want to identify how you want to think, right? So if you don't want to be thinking about, I need to go ride because I'm going to feel guilty if I don't, right? If instead you know that you want to go out and focus on, you want to ride because of that focus on what you love about it and what's fun, you want to make sure that you've kind of thought that through and you have some kind of alternate motivation in the back of your head, because we're going to talk about trying to stop those more negative thoughts, but you need to replace them with something else. We can't just think about nothing. That doesn't work very well, right? Thoughts creep back in our head. So you want to replace it with something more positive. So first of all, think about something more on that more positive, more effective end of the continuum we've been talking about that you can really latch onto and that you really care about. Like, is there something that you find fun about riding or whatever the activity is that you're going to do? Or is there some way that it feeds your identity, or something that's the more valued outcome that's really like coming from you that you can latch onto, right? So think about what that alternate motivation is that you're going to replace it with. Okay, so that's one kind of preparation step to do. Another one is that it can be really helpful to first do sort of a more of an awareness exercise, because a lot of us, when we think about our thoughts, they're very kind of automatic. We're often not very, like we're aware of them in that they're happening and they're accessible to us, but they're not that intentional or something that we really pay a lot of attention to. And a lot of us have a lot more negative thoughts than we really might realize we do. The idea here is to sort of reduce some of those negative thoughts. So one of the kind of background homework preparation activities to do first is for a day, or you could do it for a couple days if you want, is to just keep track of every time you have a negative thought about yourself. Okay, so this isn't like, oh, I'm upset at, you know, my partner, or my kids are driving me crazy, or work is really, really, you know, difficult today. It's just the thoughts that are self-reference, so thoughts about yourself. So if you ever have those kind of thoughts where it's like, oh, I'm such an idiot, that's an example, right? That's the kind of thing we're trying to get rid of. Okay, so a real low-tech way to do it is to just like have, I don't know, paper clips or buttons or something like that in a little pile of maybe, you know, 10 of them, and like move them from one pile to another, or one pocket to another every time you notice yourself saying something negative, and then count them up at the end of the day and see how many there were, right? And it's going to be a bigger number than you think, right? So the point isn't here to make you feel bad about yourself, but to sort of be like, oh, like there's actually probably a lot of room to improve here that you might not have thought of before. Okay, so that's something you could also do if you're just sort of like, oh, this probably isn't something I do. Might just sort of bring some awareness to that. But the actual technique of thought stopping is that now that you've kind of practiced being aware of when you might make some of those negative thoughts, is when you notice them. Okay, so if I notice myself saying, you know, like, oh, I can't believe I skipped that workout, I'm so lazy, right? Notice that thought and say stop. Okay, and you can say it out loud if you want. If it's in a situation where that might, you know, not go over so well with the social setting, you can just say it in your head. It's all fine, right? But to yourself, say stop, right? And then try and replace that thought with something else. Okay, like I love the feeling of going out and just riding in that flow on my bike. Okay, that might be the replacement kind of motivating thought that you can sub in for that more negative thought. Okay, it has to be something that you believe and it's important to you and meaningful to you. So if you don't feel that way, like that's not the thought you should have, but that's, you know, just an example of putting it in with something more positive. It also can be something that's just sort of being kinder to yourself, right? So maybe you missed that workout today and you're feeling like, you know, you're beating yourself up about it and calling yourself lazy, but instead you can be like, you know, look, I really tried really hard today. You know, I was thinking about, you know, I was really trying to prioritize, and there were just some things that were overwhelming, and that happens, and that's okay. And I'm going to go out and ride tomorrow. Okay. Like those kind of things that aren't necessarily pushing yourself to do it, but accepting and saying, what am I going to do in the future? Okay? So that sort of thought stopping exercise can be real kind of interesting. And then also it can be really helpful to frame how you think about your goals as well. And again, we'll talk about that in one of the future sessions. I want to go on and talk about the someone is going to reward me kinds of motivation. And many people gravitate towards creating reward structures to try and improve motivation because we intuitively feel like they're going to work, right? If I, you know, tell myself if I ride every day this week that I can, I don't know, have a treat on Friday night or buy a new shirt or whatever it is, right? Is like giving ourselves some kind of reward seems like it's going to really push us to do the kind of behaviors that we want. And they can work in the short term. And that's also, that kind of confirms those impressions and is why that idea kind of perpetuates, because it's not like it's totally ineffective. We probably wouldn't think it would work if we had all this evidence that it doesn't. But it does tend to make us feel a little bit more controlled, especially if those rewards are external. Like if we're trying to get a reward from somebody else, like maybe someone else's approval or something, you know, maybe you even are getting tangible rewards from something external. And we tend not to like to feel controlled, right? One of the sort of basic human psychological needs that we have is to feel like, you know, we have some control over our own lives. And so we tend to kind of move away or gravitate away from those things that make us feel controlled. And so rewards can do that, okay? Also, if we even if we're rewarding ourselves, it can start making us feeling like it can make us sort of reliant on those rewards to sustain the motivation. So they do work short term while the rewards are there. Then we tend to see a drop off in motivation when the rewards go away. And we often don't have sort of a structure in place that keeps the rewards happening, right? So it doesn't work the same way where, you know, for example, a lot of people in our jobs, right? It's like, oh, I do it because I get the paycheck. That's an example of an external reward. But we have this really strong societal structure that is set up that keeps that reward structure going in the long term. It's not like that happens for a week and then those rewards go away, right? In our physical activity life, those rewards tend not to be so well structured, and so we can't rely on them as well. Also, of course, even with jobs, right? Most people, prefer to have something that they find enjoyable, or sort of more on that really effective end of the spectrum, effective kind of motivation end of the spectrum. So it, kind of applies there too. But in physical activity, it can be really hard to sustain a reward structure long term. So if we're going to use them, we want to at least make it so that we don't feel controlled, we don't end up feeling like reliant on them, and we also kind of wean ourselves off. So if you want to use rewards, okay, and I'm not saying you absolutely can't reward yourself for things, but if you want to use them, they're going to be less likely to undermine your motivation if, first of all, you keep them small so they don't feel really controlling, right? So, maybe being able to, like, I don't know, order takeout pizza on Friday or something like that isn't making you sort of feel like you have this like thing hanging over you all week because you really have to earn that reward, right? It's just going to be something that's small and fun for you, right? And so that's sort of more okay than if the rewards are sort of, really big and feel more powerful to you, okay? The other thing is if you do wean yourself off. So if you feel like I really need some rewards, like to set up some kind of rewards just to get myself started, think about that as sort of building in a period of time where you can maybe be motivated by a reward, but you're also working on how can I find the fun in this? How can I find the way to be working towards valued outcomes, right? Those more positive end of the spectrum motivation reasons. And maybe it sort of helps you over that hump, or helps you get started on maybe a new activity, or helps you maybe do an activity that you have to do temporarily because maybe you can't do what you really want to do. But if you sort of spend that time also looking for those more powerful forms of motivation, and then gradually wean yourself off the rewards, don't just take them away suddenly, but it's like, maybe you get a reward for, doing it all this week, and maybe the next reward, it's like you have to do it for 2 weeks and you have to do it for a whole month or something like that in order to get the reward. And then eventually it goes away when you've replaced it with something else. That's going to be more effective and not have that sort of drop off effect at the end. And then another piece about this is the flip side of reward is punishment. So don't use physical activity as punishment. And that sounds really perhaps obvious, but there's ways that a lot of us tend to do this. And we might not think about it this way. And so just maybe avoid this trap. So for example, you sort of see examples like this in sort of just the popular media and things like that, of like examples of when people will say things like, oh yeah, like, I don't know, I ate the donut and therefore I I had to go and, run 10 kilometers or something like that to, atone for that or something like that. That's using physical activity as punishment, right? It's also, there's a whole thing around eating there that's probably, that's a whole other topic, right? That's not super healthy. But the part about physical activity becomes the punishment for doing something else, right? That you're trying to kind of make up for, really kind of can kill our motivation for physical activity, because it makes it this thing that we otherwise wanted to avoid. Okay, so if you do notice yourself thinking that way, again, another point where you might want to try using like the thought stopping to try and think about other kinds of motivation instead of those ones, and really trying to, again, move more towards those physical activity as fun kinds of motivation. The last one I want to talk about is that I'm not getting the results I want, so I don't know why I bother. And this happens to a lot of us from time to time, because especially if we're really focused on improving our fitness or improving our skills or performance in some way, because improvement in physical activities of all kinds are not just linear, right? We tend to experience some plateaus. We might really take off, especially at the beginning when we have a lot to gain, and then the increments of improvement get smaller and smaller and harder to see. And if you love riding or working out just for the process, and that's really a big part of your focus, you might not feel this way very often, if at all. Okay, but if you are really focused on some of the outcomes, sometimes that can kind of wear on us, right? When we notice that that's happening, and it can kind of creep in. So one thing you can do is to set a variety of different goals, so you can rely on some of the other kinds of goals when these ones are plateauing. And so stay tuned. We'll talk about that in the session I'm doing next in a few weeks. You can also use the thought stopping technique, again, to replace it with different kinds of motivation. Also with this one, consider if you're overtrained, right? So we're talking about motivation and trying to like things that can help us get out there and ride and get more active. But also, you know, if you really are physiologically tired, that can kill your motivation. And the solution for that is rest. Okay? So if it's that you really do need a day off, or you really do need a couple days off, listen to your body and consider doing that. And your motivation will tend to come back as well when you feel more recovered and when you've had more sleep and rest and things like that. Also, take it easy on yourself in our current conditions. We might have some things that decline in terms of performance because we can't do them, or we can't do them very well right now, right? It's like, you know, even if you're keeping up with workouts, it might be some of your riding skills you're not able to work on right now. Just like, you know, we often can't over the winter, right? And accept that, right? And congratulate yourself for what you can do, right? And find new areas and the places that you can improve right now. Maybe it's a fitness thing, right? Or maybe it's a certain kind of riding because there's, you know, a trail near your home that doesn't let you, I don't know, work on your, you know, certain obstacles, but maybe it's letting you do some climbs or something like that. I want to make a quick note about monitoring physical activity, because that's one of the things a lot of us, again, intuitively think will really, really help us improve our amount of activity or our performance. And they're really popular, of course, things like, you know, Fitbits and apps and training diaries and all that kind of stuff. Now, they can be really good because they can help you chart your progress and see improvement, and that can be really motivating, but it depends how you use them. Okay? And so on their own, they tend to give you sort of a short-term boost because you do more simply because you're paying attention, right? And so we do see most people when they get something like a new Fitbit, right, is that they'll be a little bit more active for a while, but then the novelty wears off and most people stop using them. Okay? Now, if you have them integrated with some of your other goals and some of the other things you're doing to motivate yourself, they can be really helpful. So for example, if you're working toward a mileage or a speed goal and that you've chosen and it's really important to you, and you're sort of in that kind of motivation where it's like that, you know, what I'm getting out of it is important to me, then you might stay interested because you're checking your progress and you're checking, you know, those milestones that you hit along the way towards that goal. Okay. But if you're using them for rewarding and punishing yourself, right? So like just to see like, when do I get the, I don't know, next pair of new jeans or whatever it is, you might find that it starts to feel controlling because you're in that more, you know, I'm doing it for the external rewards kind of motivation. And because that doesn't tend to sustain us very well, you might find that, you know, your motivation using it drops off. So they're not good or bad inherently on their own, but they're a tool that if you're using them with the more effective kinds of motivation can really kind of assist with that and boost that. And then I also want to make a special note about using sort of social strategies for motivation right now, just because of what we're going through and all the stuff around like social isolation and social distancing and all that kind of stuff. So of course, riding with someone else is one of the things that makes it fun. And we're not allowed to do that, at least not with just anybody right now. So a few ideas for trying to incorporate some of the social strategies that you can, or some of these will be applicable to some people and not to others, of course. But one is, can you ride with a household member who you are allowed to be with, right? And a tricky thing here, if that person is someone you normally ride with, that might just be a really easy solution, and that's great, right? If it's someone you don't typically ride with, though, you might just, you know, think about what is it that they're going to bring to it versus maybe something they take away from it for you. So what if that person, for example, can't ride as fast as you, right? It might be really, you know, fun for you to sometimes be able to go with someone else, and you know, maybe you won't be able to push as hard on those particular rides, and maybe you do that pushing on the rides when you're by yourself, right? And so, but try and focus on, you know, during those rides, not on what you're lacking, but on what you're gaining, and thinking about what you like about it and what's fun about it. Okay? Another thing is choose your partner wisely. It's not helpful to go with anybody, right? So I can say that, you know, riding socially is fun, right? Or is more fun. That's sort of a general statement, right? If you're riding with somebody else who's really frustrating you, of course, like that's not making it more fun, right? So if the person you could ride with is someone who you just don't ride with well, right? I know some of us like ride really well with our partners. Some of us don't, right? Some of us is just a hotbed for conflict. Don't expect that to change right now, right? That might not be the best choice, right? Or at least if you think you want to try it, you know, address it first, right? Like, we don't usually ride very well together, but do you want to give this a try, and are there things we can do to help reduce that? But don't just assume, of course, that social is better, right? It can be, but definitely has its pitfalls. Another way you can do it is connect with others virtually while you're riding. On a bike, of course, this is like, so something like being on a phone call with earphones or something like that. It's probably really only safe if you're riding indoors on a trainer or on a stationary bike, right? With a bike, because, you know, the whole thing around headphones and things like that if we're riding outdoors. But, you know, the trainers can be the hardest place for us to sustain our motivation. So it might be something that's really worth doing. Of course, the other way is sort of one step removed is you know, engaging with some of the great things that like the Spin Sisters are putting out, or other kinds of things online that can give you the sort of the group ride feel. Even though you don't get as much interaction as if you were face to face with people, there's still that feeling of connection, and that can be really, really positive. Another thing you can do is, you know, connect with others sort of before or after, right? To provide that encouragement to go out and do it, or to talk about, you know, sort of your achievements that you had and sort of congratulate each other, even if you're not, you know, connecting or communicating like actually while you're riding. And that's, so it's not as powerful, right? But it's sort of a close second, okay? Another thing to think about is that if you're thinking about people in your household and thinking about just, this might be around activity in general, or it could be around riding, is that people in a household do tend to influence each other's physical activity patterns. So you might think about this in terms of how they boost your activity, or you might be interested in helping sort of support their physical activity too. Just be careful with this, right? Because just like we talked about how it's better for you to be in the motivation of I love it, or it's important to me, or it's part of my identity, versus feeling like you're being rewarded or punished or things like that, or feeling guilted for it. That applies to everybody around us as well too, right? So we want to try and, if we're trying to sort of encourage each other, we want to do it in ways that stay in those more positive kinds of motivation, because the other ones tend to backfire. So what can you do? Here's a couple ideas. One is just be active yourself if you're trying to encourage somebody else. Okay? If you're active, the other people in your household see you being active, and you're a role model. And they might not, you know, instantly become more active. They might not go out with you every time you go or anything like that, but you're creating opportunities, you're creating a norm, you're creating encouragement for other people to go out over time. And don't nag them to go with you, right? Don't nag them that they should be doing it, but just do it. And that does tend to have, you know, sort of a positive effect on other people's activity in the big picture over time. Okay? Another one is to be positive about it. So share your thoughts about what you like. Like if you feel great after a ride, tell them, right? Don't necessarily tell them like you should do it so you feel the same way, but tell them how you feel, right? It's sort of that role modeling thing as well. The idea is don't try and convince them to go, just like live that it is a positive thing, and that makes it attractive for other people. So focusing on sharing your own experience. And then listen for what they want to do. Right? If other people are telling you about what they find fun, or what would feed their identity, or what would help them achieve some important outcomes for them, right? Those are the opportunities then to be like, hey, how can I help you do that, right? Or how could we maybe do that together and motivate each other, okay? But it works best and it's most sustainable if it's coming from within each person, okay? So for a quick recap, let's put this guy back up. Try to stay on the fun and meaningful end of motivation. Or it's great if it also fuels a positive identity for you or important goals. Do your best to stay out of that guilt and external control kinds of motivation, as they might help a little bit in the short term, but they tend to lead to more negative experience and kind of wane over time. And if you're feeling unmotivated and like you're not getting what you want out of riding and training, try looking for whether there's motivations you can latch onto more towards that fun end of the continuum. And we'll pick up more on how to do that in the session on goal setting. Okay. Until then, have fun, find creative ways, but safe ways to get out and ride, find ways to move, and take care of yourself.